Good morning, everyone. I am Amabile Silva, the Investor Relations at CBA. Welcome to our video conference for the earnings in the third quarter of 21. Here we have with us Ricardo Carvalho, the CEO of the company, and Luciano Alves, the CFO and Investor Relations Director in the company. I'd like to let you know that the event is being recorded and all participants are only listeners during the presentation. Soon after, we'll begin the Q&A session, when participants will be able to send their questions by chat or raise their hand on Zoom. We'll open your mic so that you can make your questions directly to Ricardo and Luciano. The presentation of this event is available on the site for Investor Relations at CBA, and it also will be providing the recording of the event after closing. Before we proceed, I'd like to clarify that some of the information here are only expectations or trends, and they're based on the hypotheses and perspectives currently of the company's management. There may be variations between the results, performance, and future events. Not establishing forecasts. The real results, performance, and events may differ significantly from those expressed in these statements. The results of different factors such as general conditions and economic conditions in Brazil and other countries, as well as levels of the interest rates, measures for protection in the US, Brazil, and other countries, as well as changes in the laws, regulations, and factors in the general competition at a regional, global, and national level. Now I'll pass on the word to Ricardo Carvalho to discuss some of the results in the third quarter of 2021. Thank you, Mabili. Good morning, everyone. I'd like to start off by thanking you all for your participation in our video conference of for the earnings in our third quarter. The third quarter was full of highlights and important transactions for CBA, besides excellent performance in our main financial indicators. Supported by favorable market dynamics in the aluminum sector, the LME price is still gaining relevant impulses during this quarter, reaching $2,648 per ton, a value that was 55% higher than the average in the third quarter of 2020. This contributed to a record net revenue with about 58% increase compared to the third quarter of 2020. The net revenue also had strong growth, 58% in regards to the third quarter of 2020, which makes it quite evident to see the positive fundamentals in the market leveraged by the volume of sales of 124,000 tons. We had strong improvements in the adjusted EBITDA, 314 million reais, 97% greater than what we had in the third quarter of 2020. And an EBITDA margin of 14%. In this quarter, we continued with the significant reduction of leverage to 1.9 times, making the company positioned in a leverage position that's even more comfortable than the past quarter. Besides the financial results, we also had important achievements. CBA was recognized with the Innovation Value Award, the Prêmio Valor de Inovação, positioning itself among the 5 companies that are most innovative in the mining and steelwork category. This recognition is a result of the advances in projects and initiatives with innovation and co-engineering that are present in the day-to-day of our business, being part of one of the pillars of this strategy. Another important highlight was the entry of CBA in a new segment in the market with the acquisition of 80% of Alux do Brasil, one of the main suppliers of secondary alloys in Brazil. This transaction expanded our productive capacity with recycled aluminum, and it also allowed us to operate with more relevance in this market within our strategy for growth in recycling. In this quarter, we also completed the hiring of a green credit line with a total amount of $100 million, which is connected to some indicators for greenhouse gas emissions, which also provides for annual reductions in emissions of CO2 up until 2025, in line with our ESG strategy. Another very relevant acquisition was our assets for self-production of wind power energy, Ventos de Santo Anselmo and Ventos de Santo Isidoro, this quarter, with an investment of approximately 60 million reais and a startup forecasted for 2023. Besides this, we also decided to create a business unit that is specific for energy to manage our 21 hydropower plants that up until then were managed by Votorantim Energia. I'd like to provide some more details on this business unit on the next slide. Well, due to the importance that energy has for CBA and its operations, we just completed a movement to take on the management of the energy assets, creating this business unit at CBA that's specific for energy. We have 21 assets for generation located in the south, southeast, midwest of Brazil, which reach a total of 1.4 gigawatts in capacity of production. Among these, 0.6 gigawatts are operated by CBA and 0.8 gigawatts are stakes that we have in other consortiums. It's important to highlight also that what's going to be changing with this new unit. We have 3 areas of performance. The first one is power plant management, the management of the operation and maintenance of these power plants that are going to be operated by CBA, with a focus on the control and monitoring of the operation, as well as the management of the budget. We're also going to be operating with the energy balance, with the planning of energy needs, and a focus on trading the exceeding amounts of energy and a representation in the chamber for energy trading. The third pillar for operations is managing the assets of consortiums and holdings related to energy, with the management of the stakes that we have in some energy generators, with some participation in boards, committees, and consortiums. So it's really important to mention here that this is going to be prioritizing operational security, maintenance of the quality, and the guarantee of control over the impacts and the financial results, as well as this movement which reinforces the CBA's positioning. Now I'll pass on the word to Luciano, the financial director for RI relations as well, and he's going to provide some more details on the overall market scenario. Please, Luciano. Thank you, Ricardo, and have a great day. I'm Luciano. I'm the financial director and RI director at CBA, and I'm going to start talking about the context of the aluminum market in the third quarter of 2021. The global aluminum demand grew 6.8% compared to the first period of 2020. In China, despite the growth once again of about 1%, it's important to mention that this is based on a high base, so the demand continued to be healthy in this last quarter. About the supply, the cuts in the production of China intensified due to the restrictions in regards to energy generation, and they're also facing an energy crisis, not because of the droughts only, but also because of scarcity of coal to supply the thermoelectric power plants. Over 3 million tons of aluminum capacity were impacted, as well as some postponing of some ramp-ups for projects. And in regards to the domestic demand, China increased its imports of primary aluminum, which really changed the levels in the last year. So with this, the physical market for aluminum became a little tighter, with a global deficit of 4 among the 5 quarters. And inventories are also in drop, very close to the levels that we had considered for a balance in the market of about 50 days. On the next slide here, we can show you that the market demand between the supply and demand really benefited the price and the premiums of aluminum. The inflation of costs in the supply chain, especially in regards to energy and aluminum, also had been offering some support to the price. And in regards to this inflation, these are some of the main factors that favored LMEs, overcoming some of the potential occasional risks related to demand, such as a lack of semiconductors, chips, and alloys. So in regards to the premiums, the replacement of the inventories and an increase of logistical costs were the main drivers that contributed to an increase in vending markets, with a special highlight for major consumer centers like the US and Europe. In Brazil, we also have the same dynamic. On the next slide, even though there was an increase in the industry costs, we have some examples that are quite interesting to demonstrate. In regards to the price of aluminum in Australia, it grew 19% in the last quarters, and in China, 28%. With energy, the increase of the energy generated by thermoelectric coal was over 70%, and it impacted especially China and Asia. As a consequence, the global aluminum cost curve went up, and also became more inclinated, with an impact on the cost inflation that are different per country and type of operation. Operations that are more integrated, which is the case of CBA, tend to have smaller impact, and they tend to be more impacted by the costs and inflations. Even in this scenario, CBA kept its positioning in the first quartile of the cost curve, benefited by the integration with alumina and energy. Despite the inflation pressure, the margins in industry are kept quite healthy, especially out of China because of the peak in prices, which was higher than the increase of the cost in industry. Now I'll move on to the next topic in the presentation, where I'm going to talk about the performance, operationally and financially, for CBA in the third quarter of 2021. Starting off with slide 8, the volume of sales of aluminum in CBA increased 1,000 tons between the third quarter of 2020 and 2021, closing this quarter with 124,000 tons sold. The demand for aluminum transformed in the third quarter of 2021 grew in regards to the same period in the previous year, with a special highlight for the segment of transportation and civil construction. In regards to the market context, the volume of sales of the transformed products at CBA grew 10% in the third quarter compared to the third quarter of 2020, influenced by the increase of 23% in the volume sold of slates and 28% in the volume sold of extruded profiles, especially for the sectors of heavy-duty transportation, road implements, and civil construction. The volume of primary products sold had a drop of 4% compared to in the third quarter of 2021 in regards to the third quarter of 2020, but we had some enriching of the sales mix with a reduction of 35% of the volume sold of ingots, a commodity in the sector, an increase of 30% in the VAP products, value-added products with the billets, aluminum alloys, and at this moment, this movement is really in line with the company's strategy to focus on products with greater added value, increasing the significance of these and share of these sales in the products by 48% in the third quarter of 2020 and to 65% in the third quarter of 2021. In the recycling volume of this quarter, it was kept stable, but when it's important to highlight that in cumulative 9 months of 2021, the total sales of CBA increased 12% compared to the 9 months of 2020, with growth in all of the business segments, including the trading of ingots with the strategy of importing ingots to the resale in the local market, increased 22%. Well, now on slide 9, I'm going to talk about financial indicators at CBA. The net revenue consolidated reached a record historically in this quarter, 2.3 billion, a growth of 55% compared to the same period last year, which is due to an increase of 58% in the net revenue in the business with aluminum and growth in all the revenue in all the segments, influenced by the increase of the aluminum LME, which reached an average of $2,648 per ton, an increase of 55% compared to the previous year. Another important factor that contributed to the record revenue was an increase of 159% of the revenue in other segments in the quarter, with a greater volume of trading of ingots, as well as an increase in the sale of alumina, an activity for the trading that we have alumina and CBA at Alunarchi. This quarter we had a negative effect of 228 million in the strategic hedge at CBA. We had some of these effects are reaching a higher revenue. This strategic hedge stopped being used by CBA in June 2021, but we still have some derivative contracts that are valid until May 2022. The energy business has a net revenue just with the trading of the exceeding amount of energy in CBA. And the market had an increase of 13% in the quarter compared to the same period in 2020 due to an increase of 28% in the average price of the energy traded. And when we talk about the cost of the products sold, in the consolidated results, CBA had an increase of 53%, influenced by an increase of 630 million reais in the aluminum cost due to the inflation of the costs in the industry globally and locally. The increase in the average cost of net aluminum production was 26%, influenced by the increase in the price of alumina and coke, as well as the increase in cost of energy for occasional purchases in the short term. The cost of electric power commercial in the third quarter of 2021 had a growth of 74 million, an increase of 43% compared to the same period in 2020, due to greater need for the purchase of energy in the free market to honor the contracts up to term, and an increase of the average price of purchase. This need for purchase was a result of the increase in the production of energy, about 37 megawatts on average, in line with lower generation of energy in the power plants of about 54.7 megawatts on average, due to the hydrate crisis, and also comparing the results of the third quarter of 2021 with the same period of 2020. And about the adjusted EBITDA, we had a significant growth of 155 million in the third quarter compared to the third quarter of 2020, leveraged by an improvement in the results of the aluminum business, especially due to the increase of the prices and sales. What harmed the EBITDA due to this negative effect in the strategic hedge, due to mainly the reflex in the increase of LME in the period compared to the contracted prices. The EBITDA of the energy business had a reduction of 64 million in the third quarter compared to the same period of the previous year, especially due to the hydrate crisis and the increase of the need to purchase energy. In this context, we had a reduction of 91% of the net losses in the third quarter of 2021 when compared to the third quarter of 2020, mainly due to the increase in the net revenue of the period, which was higher than the increase of the cost of products sold. Other factor that was an increase of other operational results as well, with a positive effect for marking in the market with contracts for the future of energy, as well as a positive effect in the reversion partially of the impairment in the nickel business. So moving on to slide 10, we're going to talk about our investments. In the third quarter of 2021, we had investments of approximately 120 million reais, a volume that was already expected with a more accelerated pace in investments until the end of the year. Part of these investments are related to the growth projects and modernization at CBA, disclosed in the IPO context and in line with our strategy. And among these projects, we have the modernization of the furnace rooms, which is already under contracts with a startup progressively foreseen between 2023 and 2025. Another project also with the disposal of solid waste and dry waste, with civil construction processes and a startup that's going to happen in 2024, and an increase in the production of aluminum from recycling materials with 3 important projects: the acquisition of the G furnace of Untitled, that's in the final assembly phase, the Rio project that was approved for deployment and is in the contracting phase, and finally the increase in the recycling of Metalex, which is in the phase 3. So we have strong generation of cash considering the raising of resources in the IPO and an improvement in the margins for the aluminum business. If we consider the raising 657 reais in the IPO, we still had a cash generation that was positive with disinvestments in the working capital, especially due to the offsetting of fiscal credits with an increase in the revenue in the quarter. We had some occasional impacts with the hydrate crisis and a reduction of the total operations. We reduced the payment terms for the purchase of metal, which was 360 days in 2020 in the pandemic context, and we reduced this to 90 to 120 days in 2021 that are more in line with the cash conversion cycle of these operations. There was still an increase in the accounts receivable due to greater revenue in the period and stability in the midterm for receipt. When we talk about the inventories, we had an increase in the inventories, the semi-finished products and the inputs to be able to service the market that's a little warmer and really offset some of the challenges that we have in the future in the bottlenecks logistically in the world, mainly due to the increase and which was offset by the reduction in the inventories of the finished products, which is a reflection of the greater demand in the market. Finally, I want to highlight the negative impact in the cash flow directly due to the strategic hedge, which was 180 million reais in this quarter, which demonstrates the potential for the increase in cash generation operation in the so on slide 12, I'm going to talk about the debt at CBA. It's mainly denominated in dollars, 97%, including a swap contract with funding together with BNDES at a rate of IPCA in reais, which is fixed by the rate in dollars. As you can see in the first graph up to the left, there was no raising in the quarter with an average price in September 2021, the availability and financial applications reached 1.4 billion reais with 83% in reais. Besides this, as we had already mentioned, as I mentioned already in the beginning of the presentation, CBA hired in this quarter a green credit line at an amount of 100 million reais, which will substitute a existing line at Votorantim S.A. of $200 million, where CBA is one of the parties involved. This new operation will have a 5-year term, and it will happen with the support of 8 financial institutions that can be accessed at any moment. Now, the net debt at CBA reached a total of 2.3 billion reais in the third quarter, including some financial derivative instruments, with the increase of the gross debt and the liability balance of the hedge due to the variation in the currency and increase in the LME. Anyways, the reduced financial leverage to 1.9 times and an increase of the cash position with the IPO resources, an increase of 165 million reais in the operational results in the last 12 months. Now I'm going to pass on the word to Ricardo once again to talk about ESG. Thank you, Luciano. Now I'm really honored to talk about the ESG topic. The ESG strategy at CBA, which we call ESG 2030, has an institutionalized agenda that's long-term, with programs that are very well structured, with a high level of commitment from the entire company. The main objective is to guarantee the supply of low-carbon aluminum and sustainable solutions for the problems of the world up until 2030. In order to do this quarter, we started some projects and initiatives in the environmental, social, and governance pillars. Moving on to slide 14, our initiatives for the reduction of environmental impacts go from mining all the way to manufacturing of sustainable aluminum, with ongoing investments in technological innovation. In regards to sustainable mining, CBA operates always with the objective of giving back the earth in a state that's equal or better than what it was before the beginning of the operation. This quarter, one of the highlights at CBA was obtaining the gold seal on the inventory of greenhouse gas emissions published in the public registration based on the methodology of the GHG protocol, with results of 2.66 tons of CO2 per ton of aluminum, liquid aluminum, resulting in 4.5 times smaller than the worldwide average. And to reinforce even more of the commitment with the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions, as I mentioned previously, we completed the hiring of the green rotational credit line at a total amount of $100 million, in line with the indicator for the greenhouse gas emissions at CBA. So for this, CBA hired Sustainalytics, one of the references internationally, issuing a specialized report on financial operations with as a second party opinion, and research also related to ESG to assess the environmental KPIs proposed. According to Sustainalytics, the target was considered as highly ambitious, since it represents an improvement in regards to the previous performance and intensity of the emissions, as well as a higher performance of the companies in the same CBA sectors, in line with a scenario that's way below 2 degrees Celsius. And still in line with the commitments for the use of renewable energy in productive processes, CBA performed the acquisition of self-energy production of wind power through Ventos do Santo Anselmo and Ventos do Santo Isidoro in this quarter. These parks are integrating the Ventos do Piauí 1 and 2 park or complex with 171.6 megawatts of installed capacity between the states of Pernambuco and Piauí, with an investment of approximately 60 million reais and supply that will be intended for the Itapissuma and Alumínio factories, which should start up operation by 2023. Moving on to slide 15, I want to highlight the social and governance aspects. So we had many highlights in the social aspect in this quarter. CBA advanced with a partnership with Sinai in São Paulo, Itapissuma and Zona da Mata in Minas, with the objective of training women to enter the regional industry, as well as promoting advances for gender equality in the organizations. In Alumínio, in the state of São Paulo, this initiative covers over 260 million women, in 4 different courses professionally. In Zona da Mata, in Minas, the offer was 24 vacancies for professional training and automation. And in Itapissuma, we offered 30 vacancies for operators. Another important highlight in regards to these indicators is that we reached 13.3% women in the total employee group in the company, an increase of 0.4% compared to the previous quarter. It's important to mention also that in 2018, when we started the process for maturing the diversity practices at CBA, there was a 7.4% women. So when we start talking about safety and a negotiable value at CBA, the rate of the frequency of accidents in the end of the quarter was 1.75, a base of 1 million hours worked, which represents a reduction of 24% compared to the previous quarter. This value is also 45% below the rate of 3.20 of the global aluminum industry, according to the IAI, the International Aluminum Institute. And in regards to the governance pillar, CBA advanced in this quarter with the deployment of the Sustainable Supplies Program, which intends to incorporate sustainability in the procurement process in the company. For this, we mapped out 7 phases in the program, and we deployed them that we're going to be deploying in the next 5 years with different overseers and planned actions besides monitoring the Sustainable Supplies Committee. The first step, the company launched a new policy for sustainable supplies to establish the guidelines to conduct the supply chain process and also include environmental, social, and governance criteria that are integrated with the acquisition process. In regards to the sustainability culture, in September 2021, CBA launched a campaign for ESG communication. Aluminum is essential, with the purpose of reinforcing the role, the beneficial role that aluminum has for the development sustainable of the supply chain, as well as the campaign that was recently launched with the ESG track to really have sustainable training to transmit the positioning of sustainability and the ESG strategy for the company for 2030 for all employees. Moving on to slide 16. I'm going to highlight some comments that are very important in regards to this quarter. Some of the favorable fundamentals in the industry benefited our results and kept us in a competitive position in the market. In this scenario, and benefited by the vertical integration of alumina and energy, CBA is capable of minimizing impacts of the cost inflation and other pressures that affect the industry in general, keeping its positioning in the first quartile of the curve of costs. We can see that the demand for aluminum in the Brazilian market continues to be heated and in growth, and this leveraged our volume of sales in this quarter, especially with the products that are transformed and added value products in line with our strategy. In regards to our growth strategy, it was a quarter of very important fulfillments and achievements, following the pace for the deployment of the projects, capex, and transactions with energy and recycling, as well as synergies with our current business in the company in order to potentialize our advantages from a competitive perspective. Finally, we continue to work in our ESG strategy, going deeper in the commitments in the long term and being protagonists and leaders in the aluminum industry. Thank you so much for your time and attention throughout this presentation. And now I'll pass on the word to Amabile. She's going to be mediating the session with Q&A. Amabile, please, you may proceed. Thank you, Ricardo. And well, before beginning, I want to say sorry for some technical failures we had. And I want to thank you all for understanding. So at this moment, we'll begin the Q&A session. I want to remind all the participants that you can submit your questions through the chat or raise your hand on Zoom. I'll open up your audio so that you can submit your questions directly to Ricardo and Luciano. And we already have a question here. The first question is from BTG Pactual. Caio, you may proceed. Hi there, good morning. I have 2 questions on my side. The first one is, I think we had a very positive surprise in the quarter. And part of this is in line with what we've been monitoring in the international rates, but we also had another part related to an improvement in the mix that you were able to deliver. So I wanted to hear from you about what you saw in this improvement and how you noticed these impacts in the mix within the downstream and primary products as well, in regards to long-term contracts you have, and this would really help us. How you're looking at this dynamic up ahead in the future. If you could maybe talk about your perceptions in regards to international rates and the premium also in the Brazilian market in the next quarters, that would help us a lot. And the second question is about the Alux acquisition. You announced an entrance in a new segment, paying a low price, competitive ticket. And in our calculation, you had a multiple of about 2.5 times EBITDA pre-synergy. So, but despite the low ticket, we wanted to understand what the strategic rationale is with this acquisition. The ESG part is quite clear. You see this growth in a very clear way with an aluminum production company with low emissions, and this acquisition is in this direction. But I wanted to understand how many synergies you considered in this acquisition. So if you could maybe quantify this a bit and give us a bit more from the qualitative perspective of what you see as relevant synergies from an operational aspect when it comes to costs, or if it's more of the commercial part. So those are the main aspects I wanted to share. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Caio. And thank you for the questions, everyone. Well, first of all, the premiums. Really, maybe the biggest impact we had in this quarter is related to the sales mix, where we sold more transformed products, and in prime, we sold more of the VAPs in the primary segment, billets and other ingot alloys, where there's a higher premium. So this improvement in the premiums is pretty much in this direction. We have a positive perspective in the Brazilian market. It continues to advance. And according to the BAO results in the first quarter, they're really relevant. And we see that the market is still pretty booming when it comes to this segment of transportation and civil construction. So on the premium panorama, we talked about this a bit in the IPO context, and we considered two references, the Europe and the US, and the premiums in Europe and US. But maybe with these operations in the supply chain and logistical chain, we maybe are more in line with the numbers in Europe. But of course, I'd say that in regards to what's in comparing with Europe is maybe going to be having an impact on the margins a little lower. About Alux, it's really important to mention that we disclosed some information, but what I'm going to try to go into more details about now is that it was very strategic, this acquisition. We were talking to them for quite a while. It is a new segment in the market for us, where we're really entering a secondary alloy and recycling segment. It's an operation that's relevant. It really makes a difference for us. They have a capacity technically that's very significant. So from a qualitative perspective, we're acquiring technical know-how as well to be able to work with different types of alloys that we're not used to working in here, and these specific alloys for transportation, so we're more present in the automotive sector as well. And in regards to synergies, we still don't have everything quantified, so we don't have all the information to disclose, but I'd say that they're less relevant than, for example, in Itapissuma, where we had the acquisition last year. Here, it's more of an independent operation. It's another phase in the segment. And I'd say that a first step headed towards growth and recycling. So we have an interest in recycling. It could be through acquisitions or investments in CBA, with some investments we've already announced, but we continue to work as well. So at the right moment, we can also have other investments, and so that we can continue to grow in this segment as well. So finally, Luciano and Kai, one of the main benefits that we're going to have with Alux is also the big learning process that we'll have in generating and raising scraps for the production of secondary alloys. We have scraps from customers through Metalex for the production of billets, and sometimes we buy some other scraps from the market. But with Alux, we're going to be really entering the market where we depend on generating and raising scraps for the operation of the units. This is going to be a big learning process, and Alux has a lot of expertise in this area. It's a business that's set up based on these aspects. So this is going to bring a lot of learning experiences so we can continue to evolve with our strategy to increase recycling at CBA. All right, thank you very much, Ricardo and Luciano. That was perfect. Thank you, Caio, and I want to remind you all once again that you can submit your questions on the chat or raise hand on Zoom, and we'll open the mic so that you can submit your questions directly to Ricardo and Luciano. We have another question here, and the next one comes from Thiago from Bradesco BBI. Thiago, please, you may proceed. Thank you, and good morning, everyone. Luciano, you talked about how you plan to continue looking at possible M&As and opportunities that could arrive. And I wanted to understand what the strategy is. Is it to continue to expand this footprint of recycling, or is there another opportunity that maybe you could consider eventually? And then my second question is in regards to more of an operational front in the prices of the fourth quarter, considering the volatility of the aluminum prices and the regional premiums. Is there any kind of consideration we should consider in the pricing for the next quarter, maybe with contracts that are priced differently than spot prices, like provisional prices? Is there something else that could be a negative surprise or positive surprise for the fourth quarter? Thank you, Thiago. Well, answering the questions here, first about M&As. I think recycling is a segment that's interesting for us, but of course we need to find companies like Lux that really have a strong compliance operation, which is very important in this segment for us. Energy is something that also involves these transactions, and we see this growth futurely where we should continue to integrate with renewable energy. So we should also be considering more energy generation to support this growth. At this moment, we have what we have currently is just enough for our own production. So with this growth that we're going to be demonstrating, and I think the transformed market's also quite interesting because here we need to look at this a little more carefully. So at this moment, we're a lot more focused on recycling and energy. About the pricing, I just want to remind you all that as this was impacting this quarter, and it all will also impact us with the next periods. So part of the price in this period also depend on the LME prices and the impact that this will have in our cost of derivatives. But besides this, we have part of the question is a little more difficult to answer, but most of our sales normally have these 1-year contracts. Some vary, but most of them are 1 year, so they're going to be expiring in one year. So we start negotiating the contracts for next year at this moment now. But the contracts have those formulas that we consider in the IPO context. So the price varies with the LME variations, so case by case. So when we look at the fourth quarter, we also have some conditions with the price reference for that sales in that month is the LME average from the previous month. For some sales, it's this average from the quarter previously, and for others, it's the average for the 4 months. So it's normally between having the LME and all of the rest of the impacts on your sales. So that's pretty much how we look at this, where the price impact that we've had could impact the results of the fourth quarter, and also the evolution of LME. Okay, thank you. That's clear. Luciana, if I could maybe take advantage of this moment. I don't know if you guys have already talked about this. If you have, I'm so sorry. But about Lux, did you already talk about what the EBITDA run rate is for the company, the margins? We plan to disclose this after the approval from Kaji, but at the correct moment, we will be disclosing this to you, okay? All right, thank you. Thank you, Thiago, once again for your question. I want to remind you all once again that if you have questions, you can send them by the chat or raise hands on Zoom. We have another question coming from Alex from Citi. Alex, you may proceed.
Hi, thank you. Good morning. I wanted to ask about cost, if that's okay, and specifically the progression of the cost from the second quarter to the third quarter. The second quarter cost was 1.5, COGS was 1.5 billion. The third quarter COGS was 2 billion reais. Is it possible to quantify the different drivers of that increase in the COGS, between the energy, the various different consumables. Any color you could give there would be helpful. And then maybe, also some color on how you see cost trending in the fourth quarter as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Alex. Thank you for the question. We can give you more details later on. I don't have all the numbers here, but I can give you some hints on that. The main cost increase in this quarter was on energy, and that is because because of the energy crisis here in Brazil, the drought that we had, we did not generate enough energy to support our operations, so we had to buy that energy in the spot market at high prices. So most of the impact is on the energy, and it's temporary until we have that scenario in the market. Second impact is on, I would say, trading of metal, because we buy metal here, we import metal, and we sell it in the local market. This quarter, we had an increase in the volumes of that operation, and that impacts not only revenues, but also the costs. But overall, we have been feeling a cost inflation as other operations in the world have felt over the past few months and quarters. I would say that for CBA, since we produce our bauxite, alumina, and energy, our impact was less than the market. Comparing to last year, not to the second quarter, but comparing to the same quarter last year, our molten metal costs increased around 26% this quarter. The main impact is energy, as I mentioned, but also we had an impact on natural gas here in Brazil. So natural gas prices here in Brazil have increased significantly over the last year, almost 90% increase in the price, mainly driven by exchange rate and also the oil prices. And also on the products, we had an increase on average since last year on 30% on that cost. And that is more or less because of international prices of most of the raw materials that we use to produce the carbon products here, mainly coke and pitch. So and of course exchange rate also impact that cost as well. I would say that these are the three main drivers of cost. And again, the energy cost is something that we expect to reduce after we don't have to buy more energy in the market. But some of these costs is just a cost inflation on the industry as a whole. And also you have to bear in mind that we also have a inflation here in Brazil that today is around 10%, the consumer inflation here. So it is always also one point to be reminding to the future.
Thanks. And should we expect to see the energy costs declining in the fourth quarter?
On a general terms, Alex, yes, because we still had some higher, prices in the market in October, but those prices for November and December have already declined. And also because it is rainy, it's the beginning of the rainy season now, from October to March or April next year. We also have an additional generation of energy from our own power plant. So yes, it should be the case in the fourth quarter.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Alex, for your question. Now we have one more question from Renato Correa, BTG Pactual. Leonardo, you may proceed. Hi there. Good morning, everyone. I just wanted to discuss the aluminum market a bit. We've been noticing some volatility that's very significant in pricing. And really this caught us all surprised, this increase of over $3,000 per ton, and of course this recent correction. And it's clear that the price is really related to coal. So aluminum is trading with a very high correlation, and basically this is due to the coal. So do you have some opinions or help because we're a bit confused with this understanding? Is there some other factor we should consider in this market, or in the short term, is aluminum really going to be a derivative of coal? That's pretty much it. Thanks. Thank you, Leonardo. This is part of the explanation. So yes, monitoring the price of coal is important so we can have aluminum reference. The second point is looking at the supply and demand balance. So on practical terms, you can see that there is some support in this level because, and then if China continues to have this kind of dynamic, limiting the growth of supply, so you can have an avoiding of CO2 emissions there, and consequently leaving the market in a deficient condition, you'd have a support for higher aluminum prices. So in this way, the prices are also different. So it's important to consider this dynamic. As I mentioned at the beginning of the slide, but even with lower growth in the demand, they continue to reduce production capacity. So in practical terms, while they do this, they're going to be giving us support with a higher price. Coal was really this impact where the prices went up and down, but there is a correlation between both. Eventually you can also consider the price adjustments, and even with higher prices, when we look at the overall market, even with the higher prices we had a while back, a lot of the smelters do not have such significant margins because they depend on the energy generated by the coal, and this led to this impact. Another small detail is that some of these operations in Europe, for example, also had an increase in prices, but that's a different dynamic. But of course, this also impacts the prices as well. But regardless of this, I think considering these variables is super important. And meanwhile, we have this considering this phenomenon with the deficit in the market. Okay, that's great. And do you still see a deficit for 2022? Because what we've seen is a series of operations that were disconnected coming back to the market. So we saw this movement in Brazil with Alcoa. Just recently, we also saw another movement in Australia. I wanted to know if this concerns you and if it also would affect the high levels of prices, but maybe how this would change your balance for 2022. Well, the market considers that it'll keep this dynamic because China is reducing the supply, and that's why the market is deficient. So you also mentioned some things in the US, but I think the initial moment could impact the market a bit more. But if you look at the potential we have, it is limited. So if we look at the balance, I'd say that it could impact the market less. But of course, this depends a lot on the situation with China, because as you can see, this year they reduced over 3 million tons of aluminum, and these restarts, considering, so basically it's going to depend on this equation, right? So you don't have that many operations that would have this potential for operation. New investments in greenfield would take a little longer, and it's not what the market has in the pipeline in the mid to long term. And besides this, even with higher prices, you need to, when you look at China and how it's behaving in the supply and demand, is really important, because that's where you're gonna really start having, when you have this deficit, you'll still have support to grow a little more. Okay, that's great. Thank you, Luciano. Thank you, Lau, for your question. And the next question comes by chat from Paula from RPS Capital. And her question is, up until now in the fourth quarter, the volume was always affected by the auto sector. Well, for CBA, we have not such a big part of our revenue coming from the auto sector, but our main focus is really with trucks and buses and implements. And of course, naturally, this impacts but when you look at the overall revenue at CBA, it's minimized. And even so, we continue to have these payments of alloys and ingots, which are our main product for this segment, with this volume throughout this year. All right, so since we do not have more questions, I'll pass on the word now to Ricardo Carvalho as he provides his final comments. Thank you once again for your participation. Thank you, Amabile. Thank you once again, everyone, for participating with us today. We are comfortable with the closing of the third quarter in line with what we were expecting. And this was a very positive result. The market helped us a lot, but CBA continues also quite solid in its evolution as well when it comes to performance and investments, as well as the deployment of the projects. As I mentioned in the IPO, we took on an important step in our strategy with the acquisition of Alux. We also continue to take some important steps in our process with ESG, which makes CBA totally open to possible upsides for carbon credits and premiums also for green aluminum. So we have some structural impacts in the inflation. Some of them are general. For all of the competitors, this also happens. Some others are a little more specific with the case of some competitors here in Brazil, but we don't consider them to be recurring. Evidently, these are structural impacts in the industry, so they happen with all players. But our leverage is relatively comfortable. As I've already mentioned, our projects have been moving ahead. Some are comfortable to deliver everything within the schedules we have in the IPO, and we will continue as we move along with our evolution. And I want to thank you all for participating once again, and we are always available.